It's no secret that the regulatory burden keeps growing. Here's a chart from George Washington University showing the number of economically significant rules issued in each of the last 40 years. Economically significant are those rules which impose costs of more than $100 million per year. This chart shows data across the entire government. The Department of Labor, including OSHA, has also created new rules. Same for transportation, including PHMSA. And now Homeland Security is issuing rules impacting pipelines as well. Other jurisdictions have also been active in issuing new rules and regulations. Obviously, we need to comply with all of these rules, but what specifically is involved in compliance? Compliance management fundamentally addresses three questions. At the individual level, what am I supposed to do? At the region, site, or plant level, what am I accountable for? And at the corporate level, how are we doing as a company? The individual contributor is mostly concerned with current and upcoming compliance-related tasks that are assigned to them. Plant, site, and regional managers are concerned with the total workload and perhaps rebalancing the work to aid groups that are falling behind. A good metric is overdue tasks and how much they are overdue by. Knowing who has the most overdue tasks may allow a regional manager to reallocate some of the work or apply additional resources. If we're going to discuss resource allocation in a meeting, then it may be helpful to have an Excel report or printed copy of the data. The corporate perspective looks over all the compliance activities. Both current data and trending are useful, as well as risk ranking and drill downs for specific locations. I'm sure we can all agree on the goals and objectives of compliance management, but how do we get there? During this presentation, we're going to take a look at a practical approach to compliance management. The FACILEX suite from Gateway Group has a compliance management application, which provides all the necessary functionality needed to manage compliance requirements and the associated controls. FACILEX is a suite of applications that run on the Microsoft 365 platform, using commonly available technology like SharePoint, Azure, SQL Server, and Power BI. The first step in compliance management is getting into compliance. Staying in compliance usually requires that we conduct ad hoc and scheduled assurance activities, including inspections, self-assessments, and both internal and external audits. At any time, corrective actions may appear, and they need to be addressed and tracked through conclusion. This presentation is going to take us step by step through compliance management. While this presentation is not fundamentally a product demonstration, we will have to use some screenshots to illustrate how you would go about implementing compliance management. One of the documents that we'll use as an example is the April 2021 Pipeline Security Guidelines. The Pipeline Security Guidelines are a good example because they reference other capabilities that you would encounter in the real world: incident reporting, management of change, procedure management, risk determination, and training. At a high level, compliance management consists of three domains. First is discovery, where we discover what requirements we need to comply with. The requirements may be regulatory, contractual, industry standards, etc. Second, after it's discovered that certain requirements are relevant, it's necessary to syndicate the requirements to all locations and work groups where and when compliance with these requirements is necessary. Finally, how we stay in compliance is accomplished through assurance activities like audits, inspections, and self-assessments. The discovery phase. Every company is subject to all kinds of rules which directly or indirectly have the force of law. Directives, guidelines, regulations, and standards, to name a few. The rules are public, and there are many providers that will keep you updated on the latest rules on a subscription basis. One of them is IHS Markit. Another is TechStreet. FACILEX does not compete with these services. Instead, FACILEX manages compliance after you get the data. Furthermore, there are all kinds of rules that apply to just your company: contracts, joint venture agreements, and permits, to name a few. These rules are private and are stored in documentation within your organization. We're going to group all of these items together under the umbrella term requirements. The FACILEX compliance management solution manages compliance to all requirements, regardless of where they came from. Requirements typically come from source documents. There are countless expectations stemming from different kinds of source documents. In the interests of brevity, we'll look at just 3 cases. Case 1. Here's a National Terrorism Advisory System bulletin. The action here is to inform your team members, especially those responsible for critical assets. Case 2. Here's an electrical operating permit. If you want to stay in good standing with this regulator, you'll need to renew the permit before it expires. Not so obvious is a requirement that if the underlying asset is modified, then you need to get a variance from the regulator prior to making the change. This is a pretty common requirement, and in the FACILEX suite, we can trigger the notification from links to the Management of Change, or MOC, application. Case 3. Here's the new pipeline security guidelines from the Department of Homeland Security. There are literally dozens of individual compliance requirements in this document that need to be evaluated and then assigned to the appropriate people in your company. Proper controls will need to be in place. Assurance activities will follow. Corrective actions need to be closed out. We could go on and describe additional cases of increasing complexity, but perhaps this is a good time to mention that FACILEX applications are all completely configurable, so as new needs arise, your solution can adapt to changing circumstances without the need for any programming. In fact, let's see what capturing a source document looks like in FACILEX. Source document check-in. Most users start the application at the participants portal. This shows all the things pertinent to your user ID. At the top, in My Active Tasks, are things that you are supposed to do. At the bottom, in My Items, are things that you own. Clicking New or Revised Source Document takes you to a list of source documents. Source documents are organized hierarchically. We have used the jurisdiction as the first level of indenture, but you can choose a different scheme. Expanding the U.S. jurisdiction shows a number of agencies and organizations with a nationwide scope. Currently, the Department of Homeland Security doesn't have any active source documents, so we're going to add an item to this category. We need to provide a name for the document. If this is an external document, we can save the URL here. That's always a bit dicey because you never know how long the external links will be stable. Alternatively, and for source documents that are only internal, you can save an internal link. We can specify the type of source document and what icon we'd like to use. Although optional, it's often good to know what the source document pertains to, such as facilities, pipelines, or wells. Some regulations only pertain to certain states in the asset lifecycle. Sometimes you receive source documents that have nothing to do with assets that you own. So those regulations are not applicable to you. If the regulation is applicable to any asset that you own, then we'd label it applicable here. Later, we do further refinement where we select the specific locations where this is applicable. There may also be cases where a rule or regulation appears applicable, but you are exempt for some reason. Finally, we need to capture when the rule is effective and when it might expire. The NTAS bulletin has been saved in the DHS hierarchy. You might wonder what happened to the old NTAS bulletins. They have exceeded their expiry dates, so they're considered obsolete. However, we can see them by clicking Show Obsolete Items. Now we can see all the NTAS bulletins, including the expired ones, in orange. Before we leave here, I'm going to check in the 2 other documents I showed previously. Here's the electrical permit, and here's the pipeline security guidelines document. So far, we've checked in a source document that may or may not have compliance requirements that apply to us. The next step is to take a closer look at the document and save the relevant items in our company's requirements register. The source document should always be saved in the application. However, we have a choice about how we're going to treat it. We can treat the source document holistically, as shown here, or we can parse out the individual requirements. Let's start with the simpler case of treating the document in its entirety, which is reasonable for an NTAS bulletin. We need to review incoming source documents to determine next steps. But in most cases, the review itself requires particular technical knowledge or domain expertise. So we need to assign the initial review to the proper resource. There are two approaches for this. One, FACILEX can automatically assign the review to a person acting in a specific role. For example, whenever a source document comes from the EPA, it is always first reviewed by the Director of Environmental Compliance. And two, a compliance specialist, perhaps with the job title of Assurance Manager, can make the assessment. The Assurance Manager takes a look at the source document and then determines if it's in any way applicable to the company. Then she determines in what domain this source document belongs to. Cybersecurity in this example. This creates a requirements review process by the appropriate discipline. So now that compliance requirements have been captured, let's move them forward. At this point, we're moving from requirements entry, which is largely done by a compliance person, to requirements review, which is performed by a subject matter expert. The subject matter expert, in this case, someone specializing in cybersecurity, clicks to look at the source document and then decides which controls are needed to address the requirement. And responsibility for this compliance activities is assigned to information technology. Let's switch gears from the NTAS bulletin and take another look at our permit. Here's the document itself, and here's how it fits into the source document collection. We'll enter the permit into the system just like we did for the NTAS bulletin. The first requirement is to operate the equipment in accordance with the permit. We'll assign that to operations. The second requirement is to notify the regulator in the event of a change to the equipment. We'll assign that to engineering, who should ensure that this is appropriately integrated with the management of change system. We will launch the requirements review process, and the program knows that engineering and operations will be conducting the requirements review. Starting with operations doing their requirements review, the first control is to ensure that the safe operating limits documentation contains the proper permit limits. And the second control is a checklist question in our MOC system that triggers a review of the permit when an asset change is made. Incidentally, each requirement and each control has a related data table. This displays the where used information and is bidirectional. The previous requirement was addressed by an MOC checklist question. Here's how the control appears in the MOC system. During requirements review, we started by identifying the controls, but now we need to specify where the requirement is applicable. Since it's a permit, the geographical scope is likely very well defined. All the affected locations are notified, and each location needs to verify that the necessary controls are in place to address the requirement. Clicking the controls icon lets you see which requirements depend on this control. Obviously, if this control were disabled or eliminated, then the requirements would be unfulfilled, leading to a regulatory action or worse, an injury. Let's move on to a source document with dozens of requirements. In this example, we'll use the new TSA pipeline security guidelines. There are hundreds of individual requirements. When they are extracted from the source document, again, they need to be classified by applicability and discipline. By clicking on the requirements icon, we can edit items individually, which allows us to set the discipline or domain. Or we can manage the collection of requirements in a tabular manner, which can be more efficient. We have now identified who's responsible for the requirements review for each item. The remaining steps are just like what we saw previously. To summarize what we've seen so far, recall that source documents can arrive from external, that is public sources, and internal, that is private sources. They are then checked into FACILEX. We saw the requirements entry process, whereby the entire source document is treated as a single requirement, or individual requirements are parsed out of the source document. Because a lot of compliance requirements require specialized knowledge, the requirements review process engages the relevant subject matter experts. The SMEs may identify controls that need to satisfy the requirements and determine where and by whom the compliance requirements need to be addressed. The applicable stakeholders implement compliance with the requirement and ensure the adequacy of controls at their location and within their area of responsibility. All that was demonstrated as we walked through the functionality using the FACILEX application. The FACILEX compliant management application has many pre-configured reports. Let's take a look at a report of all compliance items grouped by location. This is a tabular report showing all the compliance items at Area 1. Reports are easy to create, and how the data is sorted, filtered, and grouped is really only limited by your imagination. Pretty much every company uses tools like Power BI or Tableau to visualize their data. Here's a Power BI view of compliance data. We'll start with the number of requirements reviews and compliance implementation activities that are created each month. Then we'll see that 49% of these activities are focused on pipelines, and the remainder pertain to other asset types. Here, 51% of the compliance activities pertain to the operate and maintain stages of the asset lifecycle. We can also see the risk levels associated with the various activities in order to prioritize resource allocation. The work is not evenly distributed among team members, with Bob taking the lion's share, while Gloria has fewer items that she's responsible for. If we add up the monthly costs of maintaining our compliance system, we can see that there was a big spike in early 2020. Maybe that was due to gearing up for remote work during the COVID pandemic. Power BI has lots of slicing and dicing capabilities, including time sliders. And if I select Area 1 in the location filter, all the graphs automatically adjust to show just the Area 1 data. Some compliance activities require a one-time action, but many require periodic reviews or submissions. It would be great to see what's coming up in the next 30, 60, and 90 days. That's where the compliance calendar comes into play. Here's a detailed version showing all the compliance activities due in the next 30 days. This could also be shown as a calendar rather than as a list. Of course, getting into compliance is just the first step. Staying in compliance is an ongoing responsibility. And that means that we need a systematic program of assurance activities. The fundamental purpose of assurance activities is to verify that the controls needed to address compliance requirements are working properly. We do this using a number of different techniques: audits, both internal and external, inspections, and self-assessments. Assurance activities may be guided by formal audit protocols, fill in a form or checklists, or review of individual documents or data items such as requirements and controls. So let's audit compliance with the pipeline security guidelines. First, we decide if we're auditing all the requirements or just select requirements. And then the relevant controls are identified. If everything goes well, then we're in good shape. However, if deficiencies are discovered, they need to be documented. In the audit world, deficiencies are usually called audit findings. Here is the first finding, that inadequate resources were assigned to focus on pipeline security. Note that the specific requirements and controls are identified. There might be multiple findings triggered by the same requirements and controls. Once the audit findings are identified, we move on to identifying how the findings will be resolved. This is a finding resolution. And resolutions inevitably lead to corrective actions. The CAPAs can be simple or more complex. The simple CAPAs are used when there's one thing to do. Standard CAPAs often require multiple steps and multiple people. Additional resolutions can be created as well. Now that we've identified a number of resolutions to address the audit findings, we can take a breather and think about whether the resolutions are valid and adequate. If we're satisfied, then the application will generate the necessary corrective actions. With a simple CAPA, the appropriate resource conducts the work to do the corrective action. In many cases, especially when you're registered to ISO 9001, it's common to have a second set of eyes take a look at corrective actions to ensure that they were adequately completed. And that second set of eyes actually closes out the CAPA. Let's wrap up our discussion. Compliance requirements originate in all kinds of locations. Some are public and some are private. First, receive the documents and check them in. Next, we declare that an entire source document has one requirement, or we parse out multiple individual requirements. Because a lot of compliance requirements require specialized knowledge, the requirements review process engages the relevant subject matter experts. The SMEs may identify controls needed to satisfy the requirements and determine where and by whom the compliance requirements need to be addressed. The applicable stakeholders implement compliance with the requirement and ensure the adequacy of controls at their location and within their area of responsibility. All that was demonstrated as we walked through the functionality using the FACILEX application. From time to time, it's necessary to conduct an audit or other assurance activity to ensure ongoing compliance. Assurance activities often generate corrective actions, which need to be tracked through completion. Performance and status of compliance can be summarized in detailed reports or visualized in Power BI. Thank you for your time and attention. We invite you to contact us if you would like to discuss any of these items further.